A Suburban Nightmare, The War with Karen Wilcox. I never imagined my life would spiral into something resembling a suburban thriller. If you had told me 6 months ago that I'd be embroiled in a bitter feud with the president of my homeowners association, HOA, I would have laughed it off as absurd. Yet here I am, living proof that life has an uncanny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. My name is Daniel Green, and until recently, I considered myself fortunate to live in Sycamore Heights, an upscale neighborhood nestled on the outskirts of town. It was supposed to be a haven of peace and quiet, where manicured lawns stretched endlessly, cookie-cutter houses promised uniformity, and neighbors exchanged polite smiles over white picket fences. But beneath this idyllic facade lurked a force of nature named Karen Wilcox, a woman whose obsession with control turned our tranquil community into a battleground. Karen Wilcox wasn't just any HOA president, she was a self-appointed guardian of perfection, wielding the association's bylaws like a weapon against anyone who dared deviate from her vision of suburban utopia. Her reign of micromanagement began innocuously enough, cloaked in the guise of maintaining property values and preserving aesthetic harmony. But as I discovered firsthand, her enforcement tactics bordered on tyrannical, targeting me specifically with increasingly petty grievances that escalated far beyond reason. What started as a minor disagreement over a freshly painted front door spiraled into a full-blown conflict involving environmental crimes, legal battles, and the unraveling of Karen's carefully constructed facade of authority. This is the story of how one man's quest for normalcy became a fight for justice, and ultimately, survival, in the face of suburban dictatorship. First impressions, meeting Karen Wilcox. The first time I encountered Karen Wilcox was at the Neighborhood Welcome Mixer, an event designed to foster camaraderie among new residents. As I stood awkwardly near the refreshment table, clutching a plastic cup of punch, she approached me with a clipboard clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. Her smile was practiced, though it didn't quite reach her eyes, which darted around the room as if scanning for infractions even amidst casual conversation. "Welcome to Sycamore Heights," she said, extending a hand that felt surprisingly firm despite her petite frame. "I'm Karen Wilcox, HOA president." Before I could respond, she thrust a thick binder into my hands. It was heavier than I expected, its glossy cover emblazoned with the words Community Guidelines Handbook. "We pride ourselves on maintaining property values through strict adherence to our rules," she added, her tone dripping with enthusiasm that seemed almost rehearsed. I thanked her politely, flipping through the pages briefly before setting the binder aside. At the time, I dismissed her intensity as harmless dedication, a trait common among those passionate about community service. Little did I know, Karen's zeal for regulation would soon dominate my life. Throughout the evening, I observed how other neighbors reacted whenever Karen drew near. Their smiles became forced, their nods exaggerated, as if performing in some unspoken ritual of compliance. Conversations paused mid-sentence, only to resume once she moved on. There was an undercurrent of tension in these interactions, a subtle deference that hinted at something deeper, a collective unease masked by civility. I initially chalked it up to typical small-town dynamics, assuming people were simply eager to make a good impression. But as the weeks unfolded, I began to understand why Karen commanded such wary respect, and why her presence cast a shadow over what should have been a welcoming occasion. A sanctuary under siege. For the first month in Sycamore Heights, life proceeded without incident. By day, I worked from home as an environmental compliance consultant, navigating spreadsheets and regulatory documents while sipping coffee at my kitchen counter. By night, I retreated to my backyard, where the previous owners had left behind a luxurious in-ground pool, the crown jewel of the property. That pool quickly became my sanctuary, a place where I could unwind after long workdays, floating weightlessly beneath the stars or lounging on the deck with a book. Its crystalline waters shimmered invitingly, reflecting the soft glow of string lights strung between trees. For a while, it felt like paradise. But tranquility has a way of lulling you into complacency, making you forget that storms often gather silently before unleashing their fury. The trouble began innocuously enough, a decision to repaint my front door. The original maroon hue had faded over time, so I chose a deep navy blue that complemented the house's gray siding beautifully. Halfway through the second coat, however, an insistent knock startled me. Standing on my porch was Karen Wilcox, arms crossed tightly across her chest, her expression unreadable but undeniably stern. "Excuse me," she began, her voice clipped. "Did you submit a color change request form before painting your door?" I blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I didn't realize I needed to," I replied honestly. "I'm just refreshing the door, not changing the house color." Karen's nostrils flared slightly, betraying her irritation. According to Section 4.7 of the HOA guidelines, she stated matter-of-factly, pointing at my half-painted door, any external aesthetic modifications, including door color changes, require pre-approval from the architectural committee. Navy blue is not on our approved color palette. You'll need to restore it to the original color by tomorrow, or you'll face a daily fine of $50. Her words hit me like a splash of cold water. What seemed like a harmless act of home improvement had suddenly become a violation worthy of punishment. Rather than argue, I swallowed my pride and repainted the door its original maroon the very next day. As I worked, I couldn't help but notice Karen walking slowly past my house later that afternoon, nodding with satisfaction when she saw the restored color. She made no attempt to hide her inspection, even pausing to take another picture for her records. I thought that would be the end of it, a simple misunderstanding resolved, a lesson learned about HOA protocols. But deep down, I should have known better. This was only the beginning of Karen's relentless scrutiny. The escalation of petty tyranny. What followed was a barrage of increasingly minor infractions, each accompanied by Karen's signature on yet another violation notice. First came the garbage can incident. A neighbor reported seeing mine visible from the street on a non-collection day. Then there was the grass height issue, deemed a quarter-inch too tall, according to regulation. Even the potted plants on my porch weren't spared. Apparently, they weren't from the approved vegetation list. Each notice arrived with the same chilling reminder: failure to comply would result in escalating fines. What perplexed me most was the apparent selectivity of Karen's enforcement. Other houses in the neighborhood flaunted similar, or worse, violations, yet they received no notices. Overgrown bushes, cracked driveways, unapproved mailbox colors. None of these seemed to attract Karen's attention. When I raised this concern at the monthly HOA meeting, her response was dismissive. "We're addressing all violations in the neighborhood," she announced to the roomful of uncomfortable homeowners. Some residents simply accumulate more infractions than others. Her explanation carried an air of finality, as if daring anyone to challenge her logic. The message was clear: I had become her primary target, singled out for reasons I couldn't yet fathom. The situation reached new heights of absurdity during the summer months when I began using my pool more frequently. One evening, while hosting a small gathering of friends for a barbecue, Karen appeared at my fence line, interrupting our conversation with a loud declaration. "The HOA noise ordinance begins at 8 p.m., and your gathering is clearly exceeding the acceptable decibel level," she called out, holding up her phone, which displayed some kind of sound meter app. "I'm registering 65 dB from your property, which exceeds our 55 dB limit." My friends and I exchanged baffled glances. We were merely talking and laughing at a normal volume. When I attempted to reason with her, explaining that there was no loud music or excessive noise, Karen cut me off curtly. "Perception of noise is subjective," she replied. "That's why we use objective measurements. The app doesn't lie." She then pointedly glanced at my pool. Additionally, recreational water features should not be used after 7:30 p.m., according to Section 12 of the night ordinances. Her words left me bewildered. "You can't be serious," I said incredulously. It's my private pool, and it's not even making any noise. But Karen remained unmoved. The splashing creates ambient noise disturbance, she stated flatly, as if reading from an invisible rulebook. And the pool lights contribute to light pollution. At this point, one of my friends, Michael Steep, a lawyer by profession, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I've reviewed the Fair Housing Act extensively, and I'm fairly certain that restricting the usage times of a private pool on private property falls outside the reasonable scope of HOA authority." Karen's eyes narrowed at this challenge. "Are you a real estate attorney, sir?" she asked pointedly. When Michael shook his head, she smirked triumphantly. "Then perhaps you should stick to your area of expertise." Turning back to me, she delivered her verdict. "Consider this a verbal warning. Next time, it will be documented." The breaking point: solar lights and selective enforcement. Determined to reclaim some semblance of autonomy, I decided to install solar-powered path lights along my driveway. They were subtle ground-level fixtures, designed to provide just enough illumination for safety at night without drawing undue attention. To me, they represented a harmless compromise, a practical solution that adhered to both my needs and the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. 2 days later, however, I returned home to find a formal violation notice taped to my front door. According to Karen, the lights constituted non-conforming landscape accessories that created a competitive illumination discrepancy with the neighborhood standard lamp posts. Frustration boiled over into resolve. It was time to confront Karen directly about what I now recognized as targeted harassment. I emailed the HOA board, requesting a meeting with Karen and any available members to discuss the inconsistencies in enforcement. Surprisingly, Karen agreed readily, suggesting we meet at her house the following evening. When I arrived at her meticulously kept colonial-style home, I discovered it wasn't a board meeting at all, just Karen alone, claiming the other members had prior commitments. "As president, I speak for the board on all enforcement matters," she explained dismissively, waving off my concerns. I presented my case diplomatically, complete with photographs showing similar violations throughout the neighborhood that had gone unaddressed. Karen listened with a thin-lipped smile that never reached her eyes. When I finished, she leaned forward in her chair. "Mr. Green," she said with exaggerated patience, "you seem to misunderstand the purpose of our community guidelines. They exist to maintain a certain standard of living that preserves our property values and community aesthetics. Your continuous attempts to circumvent these rules suggest you may not be compatible with our neighborhood culture." The implied threat wasn't subtle. "Are you suggesting I should move?" I asked incredulously. Karen's smile widened slightly. "I'm merely pointing out that some people adapt more easily to community living than others. Those who value their individualism above collective standards might be happier in a different setting. Perhaps a neighborhood without an HOA would better suit your lifestyle preferences." Her words stung, but they also ignited a fire within me. I left her house seething but determined not to be bullied out of my home. That night, I pored over the HOA bylaws, searching for leverage. What I discovered was revealing. While the rules were extensive, many of Karen's specific complaints against me weren't codified anywhere in the official documentation. They appeared to be her personal interpretations, enforced selectively. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted an email to the entire HOA board, copying all residents whose contact information I had collected at community events. I outlined instances of inconsistent enforcement and requested clarification on rules that seemed to be enforced but weren't explicitly stated in the bylaws. Karen's response was swift and furious. She called me directly, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. "How dare you undermine my authority by mass emailing residents," she hissed. "This is completely inappropriate and borderline harassment." I remained calm, responding evenly. "I'm simply seeking clarification on policies that affect all homeowners. As residents who pay HOA fees, don't we all deserve transparent communication about how rules are interpreted and enforced?" Her tone shifted to menacing. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I've been president of this HOA for 7 years because I know how to maintain standards. People who challenge the system don't last long in Sycamore Heights." Before I could respond, the line went dead. This had escalated from petty rule enforcement to explicit threats. The final straw: environmental sabotage. Determined to protect myself and document Karen's behavior, I installed security cameras around my property. That decision proved crucial mere days later. Returning home from a business trip, I was greeted by an overpowering smell emanating from my backyard. Racing to investigate, I found my once pristine pool filled with what appeared to be motor oil. The crystal-clear water had transformed into a sickening black sludge, staining the surrounding concrete and soaking the nearby garden beds with toxic residue. Shock and disbelief coursed through me as I called the police and my insurance company, then contacted a hazardous materials cleanup service. While waiting for authorities to arrive, I checked the motion detection alerts from my security cameras, which I hadn't reviewed since leaving on my trip. The footage was grainy in night vision mode but unmistakable. There was Karen, dressed in dark clothing, struggling to pour something from large containers into my pool. She made multiple trips from a car parked down the street, emptying what looked like several 5-gallon containers into the water. The timestamp showed this had occurred around 2 a.m., when the neighborhood was asleep. When the police arrived, I showed them the footage. One officer grimaced as he examined samples of the contaminated water. "This isn't just property damage," he said gravely. "This is criminal environmental pollution. The fines for dumping oil like this can be enormous, not to mention potential cleanup costs and groundwater contamination issues." As an environmental compliance consultant, I understood the gravity of the situation all too well. The oil could seep into the soil, contaminating it and possibly the water table. This wasn't merely a personal attack, it was an environmental crime with far-reaching consequences. Justice served. The fall of Karen Wilcox. Confronted by police later that day, Karen initially denied everything, claiming the footage was doctored. But faced with irrefutable evidence from multiple camera angles and timestamps, her story crumbled. According to a neighbor who witnessed her arrest, Karen switched tactics, insisting she was acting within her rights as HOA president to address a persistent violation, though she couldn't articulate what violation justified pouring oil into a private pool. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, became involved due to the severity of the contamination, determining that approximately 40 gallons of used motor oil had been dumped into my pool, with some already seeping into the surrounding soil. Cleanup efforts required specialized hazardous waste removal, complete replacement of the pool liner, excavation of contaminated soil, and extensive testing to ensure no groundwater contamination had occurred. 2 weeks after the incident, an emergency HOA meeting was called to address the fallout. The board announced preliminary findings from the environmental assessment. Total remediation costs would exceed $120,000. But that was only the beginning. Based on the willful nature of the contamination and the volume of hazardous waste involved, the HOA's lawyer revealed that the EPA had levied a staggering fine of $500,000 against Karen personally for illegal disposal of hazardous waste in violation of the Clean Water Act. A collective gasp filled the community center as shocked residents digested the news. Karen, pale-faced and visibly shaken, sat frozen in the back corner, staring blankly ahead. The lawyer continued, delivering the final blow. Additionally, Ms. Wilcox will be personally liable for all cleanup costs, as her homeowner's insurance has denied coverage due to the intentional and criminal nature of the act. The board then unanimously voted to remove Karen from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. As the meeting adjourned, Karen remained rooted in her seat, seemingly unable to process the magnitude of her downfall. When nearly everyone had left, I approached her, curious about what she might say. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, filled not with remorse but with bewilderment. $500,000, she whispered, her voice hollow. That's more than my house is worth. Conclusion: Lessons learned in suburban warfare. Reflecting on the ordeal, I realized that Karen Wilcox's reign of terror stemmed from a toxic blend of unchecked power and misplaced priorities. Her obsession with control masked deeper insecurities, driving her to enforce arbitrary rules with draconian fervor. In the end, her downfall served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of authoritarian leadership and the importance of accountability in community governance. For me, the experience reinforced the value of standing up for oneself, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Though the scars of battle remain, both physical and emotional, I emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to protect the sanctity of my home.